Welcome to Contradicting the Cosmos, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist, the Cosmic Skeptic. In today's episode, Mr. Cosmic tries to confuse his audience about the ontological argument. Now, I am not the first person to refute this video of the Cosmic Skeptics. Faded Pixels created a pretty good video which I will link to in the description. So if you don't find my video convincing, I highly recommend you check his video out. So without further ado, let's begin.
Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
So the first problem that we run into is that these properties are contradictory and paradoxical. Okay, firstly, we have omnipotence. Nothing can truly be all-powerful. This is a common philosophical thought, and you've probably heard it best exemplified in the famous dilemma, could God create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it? Now, this dilemma is usually brought up when discussing the nature of God's omnipotence on the presumption that he actually exists. And the best solution to this problem to most people would seem to be that maybe God is a maximally powerful being, but not all-powerful. And if you're not familiar with the dilemma, the two possible answers are either A, that God can create the rock so heavy that he can't lift it, but if he can't lift it, he's not omnipotent. And B, that he can't make the rock, which means he's also not omnipotent.
This is both a bifurcation fallacy, and in the process of making it a bifurcation fallacy, it also begs the question. He claims there are only two possibilities, but he ignores the third possibility of a tie. The reason God cannot create a rock so heavy he cannot lift it is because he is omnipotent. There is always a bigger rock he could create, and he could always lift that rock. By claiming that a tie is not one of the options, he's begging the question. He's assumed a limitation on God, which is the very thing he's supposed to be proving or disproving. And surprisingly, I have to disagree with that cross-examined reference he gives. That very article he has posted actually contradicts itself. It says there are other things God cannot do besides logically impossible things, but then it goes on to give examples of logically impossible things. And they make this clear in the last sentence when they give the analogy of God can no more do evil than fire can cause things to freeze. Fire cannot cause things to freeze because that is logically impossible. God cannot lie because God is truth. It would be logically impossible for him to lie.
And the same thing goes for omniscience, being all-knowing, that is, if you couple it with omnipotence, because we come across another thing that God cannot do. If God is truly omniscient, then that means that he can see the future. He knows every single intervention he will ever make, and he knows of every single choice that he will ever make in advance. But it then logically follows that God cannot change his mind. If God was able to change his mind, then that means that he can't have been able to foresee whatever the factor was that caused him to change his mind, because if he could have foreseen it, then he wouldn't have been changing his mind at all. But if he couldn't foresee the factors that would cause him to change his mind, then he's not omniscient.
So here is another instance of Mr. Cosmic trying to claim that God should be able to do the logically impossible, just because he's omnipotent. Mr. Cosmic's argument is that it is logically impossible for God to be able to change his mind. But the definition of omnipotence does not allow for the ability to do that which is logically impossible. Another way to look at it, as to why God cannot change his mind, is that because not only is his mind made up, but the choice is already finished. From God's perspective, everything has already happened, and is happening, and will happen. He cannot change his mind because from his point of view, any choice he could make, or change, has already come to fruition. And of course that article he posts from Desiring God doesn't seem to help his case at all. It's just talking about God repenting from choices he would have made. Those are of course conditional choices based on what people decide, such as if we do this, he will do that. If we do that, he will do this. He may already know which one he's going to do, but it's still conditional because we still have the choice to do our end of the bargain.
As for imagining a morally perfect being, this is contingent upon already having some pre-existing idea of objective morality before we've gotten to the stage of proving God. Now don't get me wrong here, if God did exist, then there would be an objective moral standard. But you can't say, imagine an objectively perfect morality in order to prove God, if you need that God in order to prove the existence of the objective morality. You can't appeal to the objective morality of God as a stepping stone to proving that God. These factors are contradictory or wrong. There cannot exist a being that is fully omnipotent and fully omniscient. It just leads to too many paradoxes.
So here Mr. Cosmic seems to be ignoring the point of the ontological argument. The point is a morally perfect being possible? He's trying to claim that we need to prove morality is objective in order to use morally perfect as a prerequisite. But he said himself, if God exists, then objective morality would exist. Therefore, if he thinks it's possible for God to exist, then he thinks morally perfect is possible. He's just trying to throw mud in your eyes so you can't see clearly. And he has yet to actually mention any of the paradoxes, any true paradoxes between omnipotence and omniscience.
Now, incidentally, I'm actually using the exact same logic that William Lane Craig himself uses a lot of the time when he's talking about infinity. You may have seen him do this when talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, the idea of an infinite regress. There can't be an infinitely existing universe, it must have had a beginning. And the reason that he gives for this is because if you think of infinity as a calculable number, it leads to paradoxes. For instance, you can't take infinity and add infinity. You still get infinity, and this is just mathematically impossible and leads to a whole number of contradictions.
If the universe never began to exist, then the number of past events is infinite. But, Al-Ghazali argued, this is impossible because an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
Therefore, applying it to something like the age of the universe, the entire concept is absolutely null. I'm using the exact same logic. If the paradoxes of infinity mean that infinite things cannot exist, then the paradoxes of omnipotence and omniscience means that an omnipotent, omniscient being can't exist either.
Still waiting to hear what those paradoxes are. I've already dealt with lifting a rock and knowing the future. Those aren't paradoxes. And in what way is that the same logic? Maybe if he had actually found a true paradox, then I would have seen the comparison in the logic, but it's just not there.
Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist.
My point exactly. You can imagine all you like things that may exist in possible universes, from unicorns to leprechauns to Christopher Hitchens losing a debate, as long as these things are not logically incoherent. An omnipotent, omniscient God is logically incoherent. In the same way that you can dismiss a married bachelor in any possible universes, I can also dismiss the God that you're presenting.
Alright, I was about to skip this one because he's making an empty claim. I've already dealt with his claims of God being impossible and proven that he's not. The only reason I even left this clip in here was to get the clip of the other video so you have a more complete context. And if you don't understand the if you never heard the ontological argument before, well, that video is a good example of it.
So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait. A maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world.
What you're doing here is you're assuming that existence is a perfection. But this is a subjective analysis. We might subjectively agree that existence is better than non-existence, but we can't prove that existence adds intrinsic objective value to a concept. This is what Immanuel Kant said in his Critique of Pure Reason, that existence is not a predicate.
This argument makes no sense. First, I feel like he's trying to confuse the issue by throwing in different terminology, like a perfection. But to say that we can't prove that existence has objective intrinsic value on a concept, if he wants to say that about existence, then why doesn't he also say that about omnipotence or omniscience or anything else? I think it is fair to say that existence is objectively better than non-existence.
The atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists.
No, just the God that you're presenting. You can conceive of a maximally but not all-powerful God. You can conceive of a God which is not omniscient, which doesn't know fully what's going on. In fact, this could account for the problem of evil. But the God that you're presenting is logically incoherent, and so yes, we can say that it's impossible to even imagine such a being.
You keep saying that, but you have yet to prove it. And of course, a God or a being that is omnipotent but not also omniscient would not be maximally great.
Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial.
Which is exactly why I'm going to try to rebut them. Look at premises 2. A maximally great being exists in some possible world. But by the logic that you've just presented, this simply can't be the case. You just said so yourself, that for a maximally great being to be truly maximally great, it must exist in all possible worlds. So if it only exists in some possible worlds, then it's not maximally great. So whatever this being is that exists in some possible world, it's by your own definition not maximally great. So how could you possibly say that a maximally great being can exist in some possible worlds if to be maximally great, it must exist in all possible worlds? This is, once again, say it with me kids, logically incoherent.
It appears Mr. Cosmic does not understand what logically incoherent means. At the same time, he is ignoring the point of the argument. Is it possible for a maximally great being to exist in every possible world? What is the logical inconsistency that would prevent such a thing? This is what Mr. Cosmic would have to argue against if he wants to argue against the last prerequisite of a maximally great being, which is what he's attempting to do here. If it is possible for something to exist in every possible world, then that thing necessarily exists in the actual world. So don't get bogged down by semantics. If it is possible for a maximally great being to exist, then he actually exists. Mr. Cosmic already failed to prove God impossible by omnipotence, omniscience, and morally perfect. But he's not even really attempting to prove that God's impossible by the last definition of existing in every possible world. Instead, he's trying to just appeal to semantics. There are only two ways for Mr. Cosmic to argue at this point. Either prove that it is impossible for a maximally great being to exist in every possible world, and yet still be possible to exist in some possible world, which is a contradiction, or explain how maximally great being is impossible in any possible world, which would have to go back to the previous three definitions for maximally great being, which he already attempted and failed at.
At the time that Anselm was writing in the 11th century, he had a contemporary called Guanella, or Guanello, or however you want to pronounce it. Now, Guanello was a believer, but he didn't agree with the ontological argument. It didn't sit right with him, and his response to the argument was as follows. He said, well, look, I can imagine the most perfect possible island, but that doesn't mean that that island exists. And this may be a sort of gut reaction response. You're saying, well, just because you can imagine the most perfect God doesn't mean that that most perfect God actually exists. But the ontological argument, it's worth remembering, isn't trying to prove the most perfect, the maximally great God. It's trying to prove the maximally great being. Okay, there's no more perfect island than the most perfect island, by definition. There's no more perfect pizza than the most perfect pizza. But there is a more perfect thing than both of these. And that most perfect thing, the most perfect thing of all, according to Anselm's logic, is God. And so you shouldn't use this argument, even though it instinctively seems to fit. But fear not, because the fallacy with this argument doesn't lie in the relation between the premises and the conclusion, but in the premises themselves. So let's lay out this argument in some no-nonsense premises. Premise 1, God has all perfections. Premise 2, necessary existence, that is, existing, is a perfection. Premise 3, if God has necessary existence, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. Now we've already discussed that.
And now begins his straw man of the argument. And I'll actually end the video here before he gets too deep into it. But I'll explain that all he does is, well, he straw mans the argument into saying that if God exists, then God exists. But that is not the argument. The argument boils down to, if it is possible that God exists, then God actually exists. And Mr. Cosmic has done absolutely nothing to refute this argument. So it continues to stand to reason that God exists.